Hello everyone, and welcome to my YNR official 24 channel. Kill him. The words detonated inside Victor's skull the instant he overheard them, not shouted but spoken with the kind of quiet certainty that frightened him far more than any raised voice ever could, because Jack Abbott had leaned in close to Matt, the polished wood of the office door barely shielding their silhouettes, and said it as if discussing the weather, as if ending a life were merely another strategic adjustment on a balance sheet, and Victor, frozen on the other side, felt the blood drain from his face as he realized this was not bluster, not metaphor, not the empty bravado of men posturing for dominance, but a conclusion reached after calculation, after contingency, after a long road that had led inexorably to his name, his legacy, his empire being reduced to an obstacle that had to be removed, and panic, true, primal panic, seized him, because Victor Newman had always been the hunter, the architect of chaos, the man who whispered threats into the dark and watched others scramble. Yet now he was the one listening, heart pounding, palms slick with sweat, as Jack continued outlining the alliance in measured tones, describing how Matt's reach and resources would merge seamlessly with Abbott influence, how old rivalries would be buried not out of forgiveness but convenience, how the press would be fed a narrative of cooperation and progress while, behind the scenes, Victor would be isolated, cornered, stripped of allies one by one until he was exposed, vulnerable, and then. "That's when it happens," Jack murmured, and Matt nodded, his shadowy profile rigid with agreement, and Victor's mind raced, flashing through decades of battles won through sheer force of will, through intimidation, through ruthless foresight, and for the first time he understood the terror he had so often inflicted on others, because this was different, this was surgical, this was men who had studied him, who knew his patterns, who anticipated his countermoves before he made them, and Victor's breath came shallow as he imagined the fallout, Nikki blindsided, Victoria scrambling to hold together a company under siege, Nick raging without direction, Adam, God help them, Adam likely being used as a pawn or a scapegoat, because Jack always knew how to twist the knife where it hurt most, and Victor's instinct screamed at him to burst through the door, to confront them, to reassert dominance with sheer presence, but another, colder voice warned him that exposure now would be fatal, that predators survived by knowing when to retreat, when to vanish, and he hated that voice because it sounded like fear, because it admitted vulnerability, because Victor Newman did not fear men, he bent them, yet his legs trembled as he eased back from the door, every muscle locked, as memories surfaced of past alliances formed and broken, of enemies underestimated who returned sharper, deadlier. And he realized with a sick twist in his gut that Jack had learned from every loss, every humiliation. Every defeat Victor had dealt him, had refined his patience, had learned to wait, and Matt was the wild card, the man with nothing to lose, the man who didn't crave legacy or reputation, only results, and that made him dangerous, because men like Matt didn't hesitate, didn't flinch at moral lines, didn't hesitate to say, kill him, and mean it literally. And Victor's thoughts spiraled as he calculated scenarios, escape routes, counter-alliances, wondering who could be trusted, who was already compromised, because alliances left fingerprints, and suddenly every recent setback made sense, every delayed deal, every inexplicable betrayal, every board member suddenly growing cautious, and panic surged again, hot and relentless, as Victor realized this plan had been in motion longer than he'd imagined, maybe longer than he'd even been aware. And the irony burned. He, the master manipulator, had been outmaneuvered, not by brute force, but by patience and cooperation, the very things he had dismissed as weaknesses, and as he slipped down the hallway, the muffled cadence of Jack's voice still echoing in his ears, Victor felt something fracture inside him, not his resolve, not his will to fight, but his certainty, because certainty was armor, and without it even a titan could bleed. And in that moment Victor understood that survival would require something he had rarely allowed himself to feel or show, restraint, humility, and the willingness to strike from the shadows rather than the spotlight, because if Jack and Matt believed he was already finished, already doomed, then that belief could be weaponized, could buy him time, and time was everything, time to misdirect, time to sow doubt between allies who trusted each other only as far as mutual benefit allowed. Time to remind Jack that alliances forged in convenience shattered under pressure. Time to remind Matt that killing a king invited wars that never truly ended, and as Victor disappeared into the stairwell, heart still hammering, jaw clenched so tightly it ached, panic slowly transmuted into something colder, sharper, more familiar. He vowed that if they wanted him dead, they would have to earn it, because Victor Newman did not die quietly, did not fall to whispered plans and closed-door conspiracies, and while fear had touched him, truly touched him, it had also awakened the ruthless clarity that had built empires, destroyed enemies, and rewritten destinies, and somewhere deep within, beneath the shock and the rage and the racing calculations, Victor smiled a thin, dangerous smile, because he knew something Jack and Matt had forgotten in their careful plotting. Panic was temporary, but vengeance, once unleashed, was eternal. The stairwell door closed behind Victor with a muted click that sounded far too loud in his ears, and for a moment he stood there in the dim concrete shaft, hand braced against the cold railing, forcing his breathing to slow, because panic, he knew, was contagious, and if he allowed it to spread inside him it would infect every decision he made next, and the next decisions mattered more than any he had made in years, perhaps more than any since the day he had first clawed his way into power. With nothing but stubborn will and a refusal to accept defeat, and as he descended step by step, shoes echoing softly, his mind began to reorder itself, pushing the raw shock aside and replacing it with ruthless analysis, replaying every word he had overheard, every inflection in Jack's voice, every silent nod from Matt, because details were weapons, and Victor had built his empire on the careful hoarding and deployment of details, and he realized now that the phrase, "kill him," had not been the beginning of their conversation but its conclusion, the end of a long chain of logic, which meant that before that conclusion there had been evidence, grievances, perceived necessities, and if he could identify and dismantle those underlying assumptions, the conclusion itself could be undone, or at least delayed, and delay was survival, survival was leverage, and leverage was victory. So by the time he reached the bottom of the stairwell his pulse had steadied, replaced by a grim focus that felt almost comforting, because this was familiar territory after all, crisis sharpening his instincts, danger clarifying his priorities, and as he slipped out into the parking structure and into the anonymity of shadows and concrete pillars, Victor allowed himself a brief, bitter laugh, because Jack Abbott, of all people, should have known better than to underestimate how Victor responded when cornered, and Matt was about to learn that killing a king was never a clean act, never a single decisive blow, but a messy, endless cascade of consequences that consumed everyone nearby, and Victor intended to make sure they understood that lesson intimately, painfully, and inescapably. He drove without a destination at first, hands steady on the wheel as the city blurred past, light streaking against the windshield like tracer fire, and with each mile his thoughts turned inward, cataloging allies and liabilities with brutal honesty, stripping away sentiment, because sentiment was a luxury he could not afford, not now, and Nikki's face surfaced in his mind, her smile, her fierce loyalty, and for a moment guilt twisted through him, sharp and unwelcome, because she would be hurt by this no matter how it ended, but guilt too was a distraction, and Victor pushed it aside, resolving instead to protect her by keeping her ignorant for as long as possible, because knowledge was power, yes, but it was also vulnerability, and if Jack and Matt were willing to kill him, they would not hesitate to use Nikki as leverage, and that thought hardened his resolve into something almost feral, because there were lines Victor would cross without hesitation, but there were also lines that, once crossed by others, guaranteed retribution beyond reason or restraint. He pulled into an underground garage beneath one of his lesser-known properties, a place deliberately kept off official books, and as the engine idled he allowed himself a moment to simply sit, listening to the tick of cooling metal, because stillness could be as valuable as action, and in that stillness he replayed the alliance plan again, focusing now not on the threat but on the cracks, the unspoken tensions that inevitably existed between men like Jack and Matt, because alliances forged in opposition were inherently unstable, sustained only by a shared enemy, and once that enemy was weakened or removed, the alliance inevitably turned inward, devouring itself, and Victor intended to accelerate that process, to become less a target and more a catalyst, to plant seeds of suspicion that would grow into mistrust, paranoia, and ultimately betrayal. And the beauty of such a strategy was that it required very little direct action, only carefully placed information, subtle nudges, and Patience, all things Victor possessed in abundance despite his reputation for explosive confrontation. He thought of Jack first, of the old rivalry steeped in history, ego, and mutual resentment, and he recognized something he had not fully acknowledged before. Jack's motivation was no longer simply to beat Victor, but to outgrow him, to prove, to himself more than anyone else, that he was no longer defined by opposition to Newman, and that desire was both Jack's strength and his weakness, because it made him crave legitimacy, public approval, the moral high ground, and that craving could be exploited, could be twisted until Jack found himself trapped between the image he wanted to project and the actions he was taking in secret, because murder, even contemplated murder, left stains no amount of corporate philanthropy could fully erase, and Victor smiled thinly at the thought of forcing Jack to confront that contradiction in the harsh light of exposure. Matt, on the other hand, was driven by something far simpler and far more dangerous: results. He did not care how the world perceived him, only whether he won, and men like that were often blind to the subtler games of perception and reputation, dismissing them as distractions, which meant Matt could be led, provoked, manipulated into actions that served Victor's purposes without Matt ever realizing he was being played, and the key would be to present Victor not as the primary obstacle, but as a useful variable, a destabilizing force that Matt could exploit against Jack, and Victor knew from long experience that nothing eroded an alliance faster than a difference in risk tolerance, and Jack's tolerance was far lower than Matt's, especially when lives were on the line. Victor finally exited the car and moved through a secured door into a private office, lights flicking on automatically, illuminating familiar leather chairs and dark wood surfaces, and the familiarity steadied him further, grounding him in the reality of his power, because even now, even threatened, he was not powerless, not isolated, not alone, and he activated a secure phone, fingers moving with practiced ease, reaching out not to his most obvious allies but to those whose loyalty was rooted not in affection but in mutual secrets, shared sins, and unspoken understandings, because those bonds were harder to break than friendship, and as he spoke in coded phrases, issuing instructions that sounded innocuous to anyone listening but carried layered meaning to those who understood him, Victor felt the machinery of counterattack begin to turn, slow at first, but inexorable, and with each call his confidence grew, because fear lost its grip when confronted with action. As the night deepened, Victor allowed himself to consider contingencies he had long avoided, because this threat forced him to confront his own mortality in a way he had skillfully sidestepped for years, and the thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit, not because he feared death itself, but because he feared leaving unfinished business, unresolved conflicts, unanswered questions, and he wondered, briefly, what legacy would remain if Jack and Matt succeeded, what story would be told about Victor Newman if he were reduced to a cautionary tale rather than a living force, and that thought ignited a flare of defiance so intense it almost made him laugh, because Victor had never allowed others to write his story, and he would not start now, not with his enemies sharpening their knives in the shadows. He drafted scenarios in his mind like a chess grandmaster visualizing moves dozens of turns ahead, imagining Jack forced to publicly distance himself from Matt after a carefully leaked scandal hinted at violence, imagining Matt growing impatient, frustrated by Jack's hesitation, imagining Nicky protected, Victoria quietly consolidating power, Nick misdirected into false battles to keep him safe, Adam, ever unpredictable, perhaps unleashed as a wild card to sow chaos where Victor could not be seen directly, and each scenario carried risks, losses, collateral damage, but Victor accepted that reality without flinching, because survival at this level was never clean, never painless, and he had long ago made his peace with that truth. By dawn, exhaustion tugged at him, but he ignored it, fueled instead by the cold clarity that came with purpose, and as the first light crept through the windows, casting long shadows across the office floor, Victor stood and looked at his reflection in the glass, studying the lines etched into his face by years of conflict, ambition, and relentless drive, and he saw not a man on the brink of destruction but a man sharpened by threat, refined by danger, and he spoke aloud, softly but firmly, as if addressing the unseen adversaries already moving against him, promising them without bravado or bluster that they had underestimated him, that they had mistaken his momentary panic for weakness, that they had forgotten the fundamental rule of war he had lived by all his life, never corner an enemy unless you are prepared for the consequences. Somewhere, Jack was likely congratulating himself on a plan he believed airtight, and Matt was likely already considering logistics, timelines, and contingencies, confident in his ability to execute without hesitation, and the thought almost amused Victor, because they were acting on information that was already outdated, already compromised, because the moment Victor overheard those words, "Kill him," the game had changed irrevocably, shifting from a quiet conspiracy to an open, if still hidden, war, and Victor thrived in war, understood it intimately, instinctively, because conflict was the crucible that had forged him, and as the city fully awakened outside, Victor Newman prepared to do what he had always done best: survive, adapt, and strike back with a precision that would leave his enemies questioning not only their plan, but their sanity, because panic, he now understood, was not the enemy, it was merely the signal that the stakes had finally risen high enough to make victory truly meaningful. Victor did not sleep that morning, nor the next, because sleep invited dreams, and dreams invited doubt, and doubt was the one indulgence he refused to allow himself while Jack and Matt's shadow loomed so close, so instead he moved through the hours with disciplined purpose, fueled by bitter coffee and sharper resolve, monitoring the quiet ripples his earlier instructions were already creating. Because power rarely announced itself in explosions at first, it whispered, it shifted, it nudged. And Victor listened to those whispers with the patience of a predator lying in wait, noting how Jack postponed a meeting he had been eager to hold just days before, how Matt's name surfaced unexpectedly in regulatory conversations that had nothing to do with him, how subtle hesitation crept into communications that had once been brisk and confident, and Victor recognized these signs as proof that uncertainty was beginning to infect the alliance, that the seeds he had planted were taking root in fertile soil nourished by ego and mistrust, and the knowledge steadied him, replacing the last vestiges of fear with something closer to grim satisfaction. He allowed himself one carefully controlled meeting with Nikki, presenting a sanitized version of events that framed recent tensions as aggressive corporate maneuvering rather than an existential threat, and even as he spoke, Victor studied her closely, memorizing the tilt of her head, the questions she didn't ask, the intuition that flickered behind her eyes. Because Nikki had survived alongside him for decades and she sensed danger as acutely as he did, and while he hated deceiving her, he knew that her strength lay in her stability, not in the shadows he now inhabited, and when she reached for his hand, grounding him with familiar warmth, Victor felt a brief, painful reminder of what was at stake beyond power and pride, a reminder that hardened his resolve rather than softened it, because survival was no longer about ego alone. It was about protecting what he had built and the people who lived within its walls. As the days unfolded, Victor maneuvered with deliberate restraint, resisting the urge to strike too quickly, because impatience was the enemy of subtle warfare, and instead he watched as Jack began to feel the weight of his own choices, the strain of maintaining a public image of principled leadership while privately aligning with a man whose methods grew increasingly difficult to justify, and Victor ensured that pressure mounted steadily, feeding Jack selective information that suggested Matt was exploring contingencies without him, quietly preparing for outcomes that left Jack exposed, and Victor knew this would gnaw at Jack, because betrayal, real or perceived, was the one thing Jack could never fully rationalize, and every unanswered question would widen the crack in their alliance. Matt, meanwhile, reacted exactly as Victor predicted, bristling at the delays, the caution, the sudden need for consensus, because men like Matt interpreted hesitation as weakness, and Victor exploited that perception, allowing Matt to believe he had opportunities to act independently, to push harder, faster, and in doing so to reveal just enough of his ruthlessness that Jack could no longer pretend ignorance. And the brilliance of the strategy lay in its inevitability, because Victor did not need to force a confrontation, he merely needed to remove the buffers that kept these men aligned, and their own natures would do the rest, colliding with destructive force. Yet beneath the calculated maneuvers, Victor remained acutely aware that the threat had not vanished, only transformed, and that a cornered enemy was still dangerous, perhaps more so now than before, and he adjusted his security accordingly, varying routines, limiting exposure, trusting only a select few with fragments of the truth, and in these precautions there was no panic, only pragmatism. Because Victor had learned that survival was not about bravado but about adaptation, and the man who survived longest was not the loudest but the most observant. One evening, standing alone in his office as rain streaked down the windows like falling blades, Victor reflected on the moment that had changed everything, the overheard words, the sudden rush of fear, and he acknowledged, without bitterness, that the panic he had felt had been necessary, even valuable, because it had stripped away complacency.